Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Shadowlands Alpha Spec preview. Oh, you're in for one now. Feral, so far, is one of the laughingstocks of the Shadowlands changes, highlighting a few core problems that aren't really being addressed. Blizzard certainly could do a better job with this one, being real with you, and it seems more like a bit of neglect, maybe them not having time, more than anything else with this issue. This spec has a number of issues on live, and with Shadowlands, it kind of manages to have more issues on the alpha, and where it actually seems like the good points that some people enjoyed, like Blood Talons on live, well, they've now been eroded, and I think we're at a state now where just about no one would be happy. So, that's today's video. If you'd like more, a big lore drop went on the channel yesterday, there's other class vids, and on our other channel today, our news one, we're diving into the shifting working conditions of Rockstar Games, so you can check that one out too. Okay, with that, let's get into Feral. Let's kick it off with the core changes. Really, the unpruning kind of happened, and then not that much else, but, well, there are talent changes, and let's just say they will feel pretty darn core when we actually get onto them. Now, some of the new Druid-wide utility that has came here because of the unpruning is quite nice, but on a less positive note, Survival Instinct got replaced with Bark Skin, which is just a less interesting defensive in general. The Survival Instincts was powerful and unique, requiring some degree of finesse to use properly given the high DR and the short duration, while, say, Bark Skin is just a bit generic by comparison. So, yeah, as far as defensives go, they've got very different uses, and I think some communication from the devs on why they made that change would be helpful. But to really get into the meat, and the thing that really does have people talking, and a lot of Ferals not particularly happy, well, we've got to get into the talents. Technically speaking, there's not a massive amount of change here, but what matters is just how deep-rooted the changes are, to the point of really just completely changing how this spec actually plays in one specific example with Blood Talons. So, Heart of the Wild replaces Typhoon, which is an interesting placement, and Blood Talons is radically different. Now, like with what we covered in the Balance video, the Affinity Talents now have Typhoon, Ursol's Vortex, and Incapacitating Roar baked into them as additional bonuses. Now, I actually think that for most players who just want that flavor and that fantasy, that's really fun. That is a really big talent row. But you could also say that it kind of overloads the talent choice a little bit, as, say, having to sacrifice the healing or the damage reduction of Resto or Guardian to ensure that Typhoon is available for you. Well, that may not feel good for a lot of existing Feral players. Realistically, Typhoon is just way too useful as an AoE displace for mass interrupts to tie it into other combat bonuses. So there is maybe an argument there that while talents should not be too simple, maybe if they're this multifaceted, a single thing like Typhoon's usefulness will basically just throw off the entire row. So there you go. I guess people will find that to be a hard decision. Probably, though, it'll be a case-by-case basis. Next up, though, Heart of the Wild. This is a fantastic returning element of the class, but occupying the CC talent row is a little bit awkward. Overall, though, it is going to lead to some really cool moments for druids filling off-spec roles. However, it only buffs based on your chosen affinity, which is kind of interesting. On paper, it is an engaging choice, but having to prepare your Heart of the Wild doesn't make a ton of sense with the current design. Having Resto means that Heart of the Wild isn't going to help you in the event of a tank's death, and Balance Affinity is a lot harder to choose as a result. So it might be too strong otherwise, but this feels like it's going to be frustrating quite often, especially with utility spells being tied to the affinity that you choose. Next, though, it's time to get into the big one, right? This is seriously what has got people talking. It is the Blood Talons changes. The old form, right, was a 25% buff to the next 2 damaging abilities after a regrowth or entangling roots cast. Now, this snapshotted the with the dots and then interacted with predatory swiftness, which made those spells instant cast after using a 5 combo point finisher. So you could basically, right, hold your instant cast until needed, slotting in then a regrowth before reapplying your rake or your rip, or just doing a really big ferocious bite. Now, this new form is a lot more combo-like, because using Shred, Rake, and Ferocious Bite within 3 seconds of each other will buff your next rip by a huge 50%. Now, according to Sigma, one of the class designers, the intention was to add complexity to the rotation while reducing the weirdness of using regrowth after every finisher. Though, in a world where Sabertooth still exists as a talent, I think this might be a bit questionable. Sabertooth allows rip extension
via Ferocious Bite. So a good snapshotted rip via the Blood Talon stuff, that can stay in a single target pretty much as long as the Druid wants. That is a change that doesn't really work with how Feral's currently played, and I think it does need a bit more thought. Now, to explain this problem briefly, having to use Rake and Ferocious Bite within the same window usually means one of them is used at the wrong time, and it's going to feel pretty awful. Sacrifices should be made out of necessity, not to, optimize. There's a very detailed post on the forums from a Druid player named Tuari that runs through a few scenarios of how just basically things don't really time well. They don't line up. They don't really feel that good when you're actually in the practice of sitting there executing your rotation. Now, to go back to what Sigma said about the, reducing the weirdness, look, Blood Talons was not the most loved talent. It was a little bit odd, right? Doing a heal to snapshot your next abilities, but it did add plenty of complexity, right? There was a lot there. I was still interacting with the existing mechanics. The weirdness of being tied to regrowth could have been addressed in a far more simple way, even by just giving druids an offensive to spend predatory swiftness on, similar to how enhancement shamans can use Maelstrom Weapon to heal or to maybe throw a lightning bolt. It's not to say the Blood Talons shouldn't be changed given its dominance, but I just don't think this is the way to do it, and I don't think it has resulted in gameplay that's, just really that good. It just doesn't really feel good when that's really the way I'd say it. It does not feel good when you're doing it. Anyway, with that, let's move on to the pros and the cons. Okay, the pros is a bit of a shorter section than normal. Feral is still feral, right? It's a cool spec. You feel like a rogue with a very different flavor, both in terms of combat and, of course, utility. Feral has always been a great spec in terms of fantasy, and it is quite satisfying when it's played well. Heart of the Wild enables that fantasy further, blurring the lines between the feral druid and any other druid. And as we touched on with the shaman specs, the unpruning has resulted in some unique utility coming back, which should make classes feel distinct, right? So that's all pretty good. Like, your spec is still going to feel like a member of your class, and that still does happen here and really well. The snapshotted bleeds as a core mechanic for a class, I think that's actually quite fun to play around. It still is at its core, and having reliable utility does make the class feel useful. The increased hybridization, basically, it's going to feel great when fights go wrong, and that's going to make you feel really powerful and useful as a druid, which is really good. Well, that's kind of it for the pros, though. Let's get into the cons. So for the cons, if you did not like Feral in BFA, I don't think you're going to like it here because none of the core problems have been addressed, like Sabertooth making single target just a complete walk in the park. Now, it was just that situation where you kept on extending your stuff and you just were left with this pretty empty feeling situation with your spec. Now, if you liked it in BFA, then you might just be put off by the new Blood Talons. That's kind of what I mean. For the people who didn't like Blood Talons, I don't think this is better whatsoever. But for the people who do like Blood Talons, the thing they've liked has just been, I would say, made quite a bit worse. It does not feel that good to play, and it's got big rotational implications. I've already mentioned the very work-in-progress feeling of Heart of the Wild's location and limitations, and I've touched on Blood Talons not making a ton of sense. There are some more things that are just, I think, purely frustrating for feral players. So Berserk, it still feels quite fun, the same way that any abundance of resources will in any other spec, but it just speeds up pressing filler spells rather than actually interacting with your bleeds. And I think that having just a more unique cooldown for this spec would be a very good idea, right? It's just not that interesting. Not having leader of the pack in a world where warrior, monks, and demon hunters can give group DPS, that also could be a bit of a kick in the teeth. Having stampeding roar given to moonkins, but not having innervate and feral also just kind of gives players less of a reason to play this spec. Not to mention balance getting so many, questionable improvements, right? I think in the context of a regular boss fight, balance is better. It's just it has problems in the world right now. But balance is getting quite a lot of love, right? Big changes. But then you kind of look at what's going on with Feral and it's just kind of being treated like roadkill. That's how it feels anyway. Of course, I'm not accusing the devs of anything there. I want to know, what are Blizzard doing with this spec? It has had issues that they just have not addressed for years. And it means one of two things. They're happy with how it is right now, which is pretty unlikely given their apparent data-driven approach. And if you look at any logs for most difficulty levels, just how rare feral druids actually seem to be as compared to balance these days. So it's either that, and they are happy with it for some strange reason, or they've just not been able to solve their issues with the spec. Playing it in world content, the core mechanic of them, the bleeds, they don't really get to shine. Most mobs will die before a full rip bleeds through, and applying a short rip feels counterintuitive when a full Tiger's Fury ferocious bite ends up feeling a good bit better. And I mean, yes, approaching different situations with different tools and abilities and ways to do your rotation, that's fine. But with Feral, it feels like any cohesion in the spec's design just doesn't really shine most of the time. And even when it does, in terms of damage output, it's not really worth the effort. Like, yeah, with Feral right now, you could do less damage than most other specs for a far more complicated rotation. And then you move that into this current Shadowlands iteration, and it's like, yeah, the pros of that fun, intricate Blood Talents gameplay, they're kind of gone because the new one is really bizarre. And then the actual, the lining up of the amount of combo points that you've got and the abilities that you want to use with that new sort of combo mechanic that is driving the new Blood Talons, it just doesn't really feel good. So in terms of some ideas to improve it, here are some of ours. I would say lower duration and more damaging bleeds would be a fun baseline to this spec. Bringing back some flavor of jagged wounds, right? Just, sort of allowing those things to be more useful in the world content. Now, in terms of interacting with those bleeds, I think limited ways to extend them with finishers would be a nice way to optimize snapshotted dots, or even adding some ways to maybe increase bleed damage without refreshing the duration. If we just have this idea of playing around with the dots, that could be a little bit more interesting. Of course, not not extending snapshot things essentially infinitely. I think something like a feral version of Deathbolt, right, as a talent, that could maybe work here. Maybe rewarding players who can snapshot their bleeds and immediately feel that reward on a shorter fight. So just to explain that, Deathbolt basically does more damage based on the amount of dots you've got on the target. So with this, you can imagine the fantasy, right? You're a feral druid, you've just scrabbed the hell out of your opponent, bleeding everywhere, and you could just call it like, I'm not going to say go for the finish or something, but something where the fantasy is that the feral druid's opponent is like bleeding, and then the feral druid just goes into that wound, and the heavier the opponent is bleeding, the more damage the druid will do when they go in there. And that could start to be really interesting. Certainly, I think it would feel quite rewarding. You'd be setting stuff up, and then instead of just, spinning some plates, you could actually capitalize in the thing that you've set up. Now, that would have implications for the balance of their sort of damage profile overall, but I think it would be a more interactive way to play this spec. And maybe something like that, combined with a slightly more easy to use Blood Talons, would make it feel like a more balanced spec overall. Because you could maybe say the Blood Talons right now is just way too complex for most players, doesn't really work in the, in the overall game, and maybe that's why Blizzard want to make it a bit more simple now. Well, yeah, you could make it a bit more simple, but then if you add one or two other mechanics that let people capitalize on the, the dot snapshotting, yeah, maybe there could be something there. And then, of course, it just has problems like dead talents. I mean, you look at its talent row, the talent that was supposed to replace the Legion artifact weapon, dead throughout BFA. And, it's just like there's gameplay there that's kind of missing. And certainly in the Shadowlands version, we're feeling that with the core, like just the base of the spec. Now, is it true that I was going to say the soulbinds. Realistically, the soulbinds are not that impactful. But is it true that your Covenant abilities could help us out? I mean, yes, but that doesn't really get to the heart of the problem, which is the basic design of the spec, essentially. So all in all, this spec needs a lot of work in ironing out tuning issues and core gameplay concerns. A lot of that is down to tuning and how effective abilities are, but I would like to see this get more substantial changes. I think if there's a class that I want to see a partial revamp of, or a spec even, it is this one. Feral, it's a strong staple, but it's consistently felt like the black sheep among both melee classes and druid specs. I mean, just look at how much love Balance has got with its constant iteration. I don't feel like Feral's got the same love there. I really think someone on the team needs to pick up this spec as their darling, as their baby, and just give it the care and the attention that it actually, I think, does deserve. Because spec swapping, the fantasy, being able to prowl about the place, use your speed buff, running around as a cat, that all is really cool thematically. Right now, we just need to get that gameplay up to snuff.
So there you have it, a little bit of a grim situation, I will admit right now. But it is alpha, right? And feedback like this that's not particularly super happy, well, that's the entire point of alpha. And what does make me think there's a little bit of hope here, I guess, is the types of changes that I would like to see that I think would maybe give this spec an identity that works a little bit better. I don't think that those changes would require a lot of expensive stuff, right? So I don't think they'd require massive new animations or new spell effects or, things that would really go beyond the scope of just the core class design team. So I really do think that if we can work out how to get, shorter duration, higher damage per second bleeds, and then something in their kit that is really exploiting the magnitude of those bleeds and sort of build a spec around that, then maybe it would capture the sort of feral ferocity of this style of roguelike gameplay instead of, the classic rogue stuff that it's kind of aping. So there you go. I'd love to know what you think if you're a feral druid, certainly. And if you are a DPS druid, how does feral stack up versus bounce? Do let me know. There is other class content on the channel. There'll be a lot more to come, so sub for that. And yeah, with that, cheers. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you next time.